In order to choose which isolation method we would use, we need first to identify the fluid characteristics, the conditions in which it flows, and in case of fluid accidental release, shall it have a great safety and environmental impact? Shall it cause a great loss? If we evaluated these factors properly, this shall help us choose the proper isolation method. Otherwise, we don't want either to add a method that lacks proper isolation and can't protect the operator in case of fluid release, or makes the maintenance operation unsafe or exaggerated. And we don't also want an exaggerated method that adds lots of valves and procedures when there is no much risk. So the first factor we need to study is the fluid itself. Is the fluid hazardous? Is it toxic, for example, such as H2S? Or is it carcinogenic? Does it have some effect on the operator's health? Is the fluid flammable or explosive, such as hydrogen, for example? Is the fluid operating at a high temperature? If the fluid in itself is highly hazardous, then this is an important factor that needs to be considered. Most probably, an unproved isolation or even proved isolation may not be accepted, and we may need to add a positive isolation in this case, depending on the severity of fluid release. But the issue is not only in the fluid itself. Maybe the fluid in itself is not hazardous, but under a pressure in which it's operated and the expected volume to be released is too high. This leads us to the second factor, which is related to the release volume. If the fluid is operating at high pressure, this means that the valves may be passing fluid to the downstream system, or the flanges may be leaking, releasing the fluid to the atmosphere. This means that at least proved isolation would be needed, or maybe even positive isolation if we are talking about other factors such as the fluid being highly hazardous. If the pipe from which we need to isolate the system has a large size, this means that in case of release, there is a large fluid volume subject to release, which is an environmental issue. It may be even a safety issue when combining it with hazardous fluid. In this case, we may also need a positive isolation. So the expected release volume is also an important factor to be considered here. The third factor is the release location. If release occurred, how many personnel are expected to be in the area of release? If the area where the system we need to isolate is manned and there are always personnel working in this area, then this personnel may be affected by the fluid release. In this case, we should take precautions to protect them. What are the surrounding environment, the surrounding equipment? How would they be affected? Will they cause a greater issue, such as rotating equipment, for example, if the fluid is a hydrocarbon? A hydrocarbon release can make an explosive mixture with any spark from this rotating equipment, such as a pump or a compressor. So here we are talking even about a very severe consequence based on the location of gas release. Maybe if the fluid has some hazard operating at some pressure, but there are no personnel expected to be in the area and there are no surrounding equipment like some stations, for example, in the desert, then in this case, we can't tolerate the release hazard. So we have seen many factors that affect the isolation method. Combining these factors and getting the conclusion to choose the proper method, this depends on the company's or the project's isolation philosophy. This may vary depending on the circumstances of the project. For example, applying double block and bleed on all isolation valves would depend on the pipe flange rating, which is directly related to the design pressure and design temperature. For example, if the pipe flange rating is 600 pounds, for example, or more, some companies may use double block and bleed in this case. If it is less, then they would just use a single valve with a bleed, and it would be sufficient for them. Others may consider double block and bleed at even 900 pounds, so they won't add double block and bleed at a flange rating of 600. Others may choose 300 pounds, which is very conservative here, because only 150 pounds we won't consider double block and bleed. This shall mean much more valves. So it mainly depends on the standard of the company itself, depending on the flange rating. But if the fluid is highly hazardous, then we would need to apply double block and bleed even for lower piping ratings, as we explained in the previous video.